So it's 1991,
Okay.
and a team of scientists in this freezing, brightly lit laboratory, they place a single cigarette-sized piece of century-old steel into a heavy metal vise.
Right, setting up a stress test.
Exactly. They pull back this massive 67-pound mechanical pendulum on a 2.5-foot arm. Now, if this piece of steel behaves like modern ship metal, the pendulum will strike it and the steel will simply, well, it'll bend.
Should just absorb the blow.
Yeah, but when they release the pendulum, it strikes the steel with a sharp, violent ping. I mean, the metal doesn't dent, it doesn't buckle at all. It
just breaks.
It completely shatters like a dropped porcelain plate. Pieces are literally flying across the room, and in that one fraction of a second, the 70-year-old mystery was basically solved.
And, you know, that shattered piece of metal is exactly why we have to completely reframe how we think about this entire event.
Yeah.
Because when you see that steel break like glass, the whole mythology just sort of dissolves.
It really does.
We are so conditioned to view this story through the lens of sweeping cinematic romance, you know, dramatic violin music, and this sense of inevitable tragic destiny.
Right, the movie version.
Exactly. But that lab test proves we aren't looking at a movie set. We're looking at a crime scene.
A historical cold case.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It is a deeply flawed, entirely preventable mass casualty event that was really driven by industrial hubris.
So pull up a chair to the table, grab your coffee. We are really glad you're here with us on this deep dive because tonight we are interrogating the sinking of the RMS Titanic from the seabed up.
And we've compiled a massive stack of sources for you today.
Oh, yeah. I'm talking actual metallurgical forensic reports, deep-sea biological surveys from the wreck site, original transcripts from the grueling 1912 United States Senate inquiries.
And the demographic survival statistics, which are frankly just chilling to read.
They really are. Our mission here is to break down the painfully compressed timeline, the hard microscopic science of why this so-called unsinkable 46,000-ton Leviathan went down so fast.
As well as the staggering social geometry that decided who lived and who died.
And how the physical crime scene itself is, well, it's currently disappearing into the ocean floor as we speak.
Right, so we're going to keep the energy calm, grounded, and intensely curious tonight. Because to even begin understanding the structural failures, we have to isolate the raw timeline.
The speed of it.
Yes, the speed of this catastrophe is what makes it so terrifying. So it's April 14, 1912. The sea is famously, eerily calm.
Survivors described it as looking like a sheet of black glass reflecting the stars.
Right, and at 11:39 p.m., lookout Frederick Fleet spots the shadow of an iceberg directly in the ship's path.
He rings the warning bell 3 times.
He calls down to the bridge, and the impact happens at exactly 11:40 p.m.
1 single minute of warning. I mean, I kept running that math in my head while going through the sources.
It's nothing.
For a vessel of that incredible mass, over 46,000 tons, moving at 22 knots, which is roughly 25 miles per hour, 60 seconds is practically a rounding error in physics.
You simply cannot overcome the inertia of that much forward momentum.
Right. And the ship's designer, Thomas Andrews, who was actually on board for the maiden voyage, he knew this intimately.
Well, the physics dictated the damage. It wasn't a head-on collision.
Which is counterintuitive, right? You'd think a head-on crash would be worse.
You would think so. But a head-on crash would have crumpled the bow, killed crewmen in the immediate impact zone, sure. But the ship likely would have stayed afloat.
Because the damage would be contained to just the first couple of compartments.
Exactly. Instead, the crew tried to turn, which resulted in a glancing blow, a 300-foot side swipe along the starboard hull.
And that scrape compromised the first 5 watertight compartments and just slightly pierced the 6th.
Which triggered that infamous mathematical certainty. Andrews goes down, he surveys the flooding in the mailroom and the squash court, and he doesn't even need a calculator.
He just knows.
He knows the buoyancy limits of his own design. He gives the ship about 2 hours.
And he was chillingly accurate. By 2:20 a.m. on April 15, the stern slips beneath the surface.
The total elapsed time from the first scrape of ice to the ship vanishing entirely is just 2 hours and 40 minutes.
I mean, imagine the psychological whiplash for the 2,200 people on board.
Right. They are asleep or maybe enjoying a late drink in an opulent heated lounge.
Entirely secure in what they think is the absolute pinnacle of human engineering.
And suddenly, the physical world just betrays them. They are thrown onto a 2-hour ticking clock in the middle of the freezing North Atlantic.
Wait, so I have to challenge the core premise here, though.
Okay.
If this ship was the crown jewel of the White Star Line, right? touted by the press as practically unsinkable, how does a sideswipe take it down in under 3 hours?
That's the big question.
Because reading the initial blueprints, the ship looks like a fortress. Was the design just fundamentally flawed from day one?
It was flawed at an atomic level, which brings us right back to that freezing laboratory in 1991.
The pendulum test.
Right. The scientists who found that frisbee-sized chunk of the hull didn't just smash it for fun. They were running what's called a Charpy V-notch test.
Okay, to figure out what exactly?
To understand the specific chemical behavior of that 1912 steel. They'd chilled the Titanic steel in a bath of alcohol down to -1 degree Celsius.
To perfectly simulate the water temperature on the night of the sinking.
Exactly. And they did the same with a piece of modern, high-quality ship steel to set a baseline.
I read the technical specs of that test, and the contrast is just wild.
It really is.
When the heavy pendulum hits the modern chilled steel, it just halts with a heavy thud. The modern steel deforms into a V shape, but it stays in one piece.
That's called ductility. The atoms are able to slide past one another and absorb the kinetic energy.
But the Titanic steel lost all its ductility in the freezing water.
It suffered from brittle fracture. Think of taking a regular caramel candy bar, okay?
Okay.
At room temperature, you can bend it, twist it, and it just stretches.
Right.
But if you put that same candy bar in the freezer overnight and then try to bend it, it snaps instantly with clean edges.
That is exactly what happened to the hull.
The chemistry of the steel forged in the early 1900s was completely unsuited for sub-zero temperatures. It contained abnormally high levels of oxygen and sulfur.
And the sulfur was the real silent killer here. From what I gathered in the metallurgical breakdown, the sulfur combined with magnesium in the forging process to create these microscopic anomalies.
They call them magnesium sulfide stringers.
Stringers. They essentially acted as subterranean highways for cracks to travel through the metal.
Yes, highways for crack propagation.
So when that 46,000-ton mass scraped against the sheer density of the iceberg, the steel didn't dent or buckle inward. The bonds just gave up. It shattered.
But the failure cascades even further than just the steel plates.
What do you mean?
Well, the hull plates themselves were brittle, but they were also fastened to the ship's internal framing using wrought iron rivets.
Ah, the rivets.
Yeah. As the iceberg dragged along the side, the inward pressure was astronomical. Some of those rivet heads simply popped off like buttons on a tight shirt. Others stretched and violently snapped, which allowed the steel plates to separate. The forensic engineers describe it as the hull literally unzipping along the seams.
Unzipping. That visual is horrific.
It is.
The seams opened up into these massive, narrow gashes, some stretching almost 40 feet long.
And thousands of tons of seawater start blasting through those gaps.
But even then, my mind kept going back to the watertight compartments. Because the whole unsinkable myth was built on this internal defense system.
Right.
The blueprints clearly show 16 distinct compartments divided by massive steel doors.
Right.
If the outer skin unzips, the internal walls are supposed to trap the water.
In a modern ship, yes. But the Titanic had a fatal architectural oversight.
Which was?
Those 16 compartments were only watertight horizontally. The transverse bulkheads, the massive walls separating one room from the next, did not go all the way up to the ceiling of the ship.
Wait, really?
No, they stopped arbitrarily around Deck E or Deck D, which was only a few feet above the waterline.
So they essentially built a fortress, but forgot to put a roof on the rooms.
Exactly like an ice cube tray. Imagine filling an ice cube tray with water and then tilting it forward.
The water doesn't stay in the first square.
Right, it spills over the low divider into the next square and then the next.
Because the ship's designers had calculated it could survive if the first 4 compartments flooded.
But because the iceberg sideswipe opened up 5, the massive weight of the incoming water pulled the front of the ship downward.
So as the bow pitched deeper into the ocean, the water level inside the first compartment rose until it simply crested the top of the wall and cascaded down into the second compartment.
A complete cascading failure.
Once that tipping point was reached, there was nothing anyone could do. The ship was literally dragging itself under.
Yeah.
But sitting with these engineering reports, I have to ask, did the engineers in 1912 just not understand the materials they were building with? Were they arrogant or just ignorant?
It's really a tragic intersection of industrial ambition and the limits of contemporary science. I mean, this was the peak of the Gilded Age. They had the mechanical engineering capability to build at an unprecedented scale, forging a ship the size of a skyscraper.
But the field of material science simply hadn't caught up.
Not at all. They did not have the microscopic tools or the deep chemical understanding of the ductile to brittle transition temperature of steel.
They didn't know that sub-zero water would turn their massive hull into glass.
Exactly. They thought they were pushing the boundaries of human achievement, but they were actually sailing entirely blind past the edge of their own scientific knowledge.
And that ignorance had a devastating human cost. Because while the physical failure of the ship is a masterclass in flawed metallurgy, the evacuation itself failed just as spectacularly.
Absolutely.
When you pull away from the steel and look at the demographic sources, the sheer survival statistics, you see a social geometry that is just as rigid and just as deadly as the bulkheads.
The evacuation transforms this from an engineering disaster into a sociological one.
It really does.
The class disparities dictate everything about who makes it into a lifeboat.
Let's break down those numbers because they completely shatter the illusion of a shared egalitarian tragedy.
Go for it.
Out of the approximately 2,224 people on board, only 705 survived. But survival wasn't a lottery, it was a hierarchy.
Very much so.
62% of first-class passengers survived. In second class, that drops to about 41 to 43%. And for third class, the steerage passengers who were mostly immigrants, only 24 to 25% made it out.
But the metric that really forces you to stop and take a breath is the children.
Oh, man. Yeah.
The statistics surrounding the children are the most searing indictment of the evacuation process.
In first class, there were 7 children on board. 6 of them survived.
Right.
The only child lost in first class was a 2-year-old girl named Lorraine Allison, and her death wasn't because she was denied a seat.
No, it was a tragedy of miscommunication.
Exactly. Her family tragically refused to leave the sinking deck because they were frantically searching for their infant son, completely unaware that his nurse had already taken him to safety on a lifeboat.
They stayed together to search, and they died together.
And then in second class, all 24 children survived, a 100% survival rate.
And in third class.
Out of the 79 children in steerage, 52 of them died.
Let that contrast really set in for a second. First class loses 1 child under a tragic misunderstanding. Second class loses 0. Third class loses 52.
That fundamentally unravels the popular historical narrative of women and children first.
Actually digging into the survivor testimonies, women and children first wasn't even a unified rule.
What do you mean?
It was a suggestion that was interpreted wildly differently depending on which side of the boat deck you were standing on.
Right, because Captain Edward Smith gave the general order, but he left the execution to his officers.
Exactly. On the port side, Officer Charles Lightoller interpreted the order as women and children only.
Only.
He was so rigid about this that he would literally lower lifeboats that were half empty rather than allow a grown man to step into a vacant seat.
Which is how you end up with lifeboats designed and tested to hold 65 adults floating away into the dark with only 20 or 28 people sitting in them.
It's a massive, fatal inefficiency.
Right. Meanwhile, on the starboard side, Officer William Murdoch interpreted the rule as women and children first.
Meaning he would load all the women and children standing there, and if there was still room, he let the men board.
So your odds of survival as a man drastically increased just by walking to the right side of the ship.
Yes, but for the steerage passengers, getting to the boat deck at all was an entirely different nightmare.
Because the architecture of the ship weaponized their social status against them.
Exactly. The lifeboats were entirely located on the uppermost decks, the exclusive domain of first and second class.
While the third-class passengers were housed deep in the bowels of the ship, mostly on decks F and G.
Down near the roaring engines and the waterline.
Looking at the deck plans, they didn't have access to the grand sweeping staircases. They had to navigate this chaotic labyrinth of narrow corridors, steep utility stairs, and confusing signage.
And worse, they encountered locked iron gates blocking their path to the upper decks.
We have to add critical historical context to those locked gates because it wasn't just like wealthy snobbery keeping them shut.
Right, it was international law. Specifically, United States immigration laws.
To prevent the spread of infectious diseases like cholera or typhus, U.S. law required that steerage passengers who were arriving as immigrants be kept strictly segregated from the upper-class travelers during the entire Atlantic crossing.
Because when the ship docked in New York, those steerage passengers would be ferried to Ellis Island for invasive health inspections, while the wealthy bypassed it entirely.
So the ship was physically designed to keep them trapped below.
And on the night of the sinking, that bureaucratic architecture became a death trap.
There are deeply conflicting survivor reports on whether the stewards ever received orders to unlock those gates or if desperate passengers eventually had to smash them down in the dark as the water rose.
But the delay was fatal regardless. By the time a massive surge of humanity from third class finally broke through the maze and poured out onto the freezing boat deck, almost all of the lifeboats had already been lowered.
It forces the question. Was there intentional, malicious intent to let the poorer passengers drown? Or was it a byproduct of sheer geographic and bureaucratic indifference?
That's the most chilling realization in the sources. You don't need a cartoon villain locking doors and laughing to create a massacre.
Systemic indifference does the job perfectly.
Yes. The entire crew was socially conditioned to cater to first class. When the collision happened, stewards politely knocked on first-class doors, helped them with their life belts, and escorted them up.
But down in steerage, the stewards were overwhelmed, didn't communicate the urgency, and in some cases literally told passengers to go back to sleep because they didn't want to panic.
The implicit rule, baked into the very steel of the ship, was first class first.
It is a profound demonstration of how socioeconomic status dictates survivability during a sudden crisis.
The people with the most resources were physically elevated above the danger. They received accurate information from the crew earlier, and the social norms of the era inherently prioritized their lives.
And the tragedy of that isolation is compounded by the fact that they weren't actually alone in the ocean. While the hull is unzipping, the compartments are overflowing, and families in steerage are trapped behind iron grates, there is another ship.
A ship sitting close enough to watch it all happen.
The ultimate bystander. The SS Californian.
The story of the Californian is arguably the most frustrating and haunting element of the entire cold case.
It really is.
It represents a total breakdown of human intuition and maritime communication.
Let's trace exactly what happened on that ship. Earlier that evening, the Californian, which is a much smaller steamer, is completely surrounded by a massive field of pack ice.
The captain decides it's too dangerous to move in the dark, so he orders the engine stopped.
And around 10:55 p.m., their sole radio operator, a young guy named Cyril Evans, realizes the Titanic is approaching the same ice field. So he fires up his wireless set to send a warning.
But we need to understand how that early wireless technology actually functioned.
It wasn't like modern radio or sending a quiet text message.
Not at all. The Marconi wireless sets of 1912 used spark gap transmitters. They literally generated electrical sparks to create radio waves.
They were incredibly loud, deafening machines.
When a signal came in from a ship that was physically close, the sound would violently blast through the receiving operator's headphones.
Which explains the terrible interaction that follows. On the Titanic, the senior wireless operator, Jack Phillips, is completely exhausted.
He is working through a massive backlog of passenger messages.
Wealthy first-class passengers were basically using the cutting-edge Marconi machine to text their friends in New York and London about how great their trip was.
So Phillips is stressed, trying to hear weak signals from a relay station in Newfoundland, when suddenly Cyril Evans' ice warning blasts into his ears at deafening volume because the Californian is so close.
And Phillips loses his temper and taps back, shut up, I'm busy, I'm working Cape Race."
It's a catastrophic failure of protocol. You have to remember, these operators weren't technically part of the ship's crew.
They were private employees of the Marconi Company.
Right. Their primary revenue-generating job was sending luxury telegrams, not providing navigational safety.
There was no standardized hierarchy prioritizing ice warnings over rich passengers' greeting card.
So, feeling rebuked, Cyril Evans takes his headphones off. At 11:35 p.m., exactly 5 minutes before the Titanic strikes the iceberg, Evans powers down the loud, sparking machine, closes up his cabin, and goes to sleep.
He was the only operator on board. The Californian's radio went completely dead.
5 minutes. The margin of history is agonizing.
Cut to an hour later. It's past midnight. The Titanic is foundering. They have no wireless contact with the California, so they resort to the oldest distress signal in the book. They start firing white distress rockets high into the black sky.
And the officers standing watching the freezing deck of the Californian clearly see a ship in the distance, and they see it firing white rockets into the stars.
White rockets have one universal meaning at sea: absolute distress. Emergency.
Yet, when the officers go down to the chart room to wake their captain, Stanley Lord, and tell him, "Sir, there's a ship firing rockets," Captain Lord does something inexplicable.
He dismisses it.
He asks them if they are sure the rockets were white, suggesting maybe they were company signals.
Because at the time, shipping lines sometimes fired colored flares at night to identify themselves to other ships.
But the officers explicitly told him they were white, and they were being fired in regular intervals.
If we put on our forensic hats and look at the psychology here, how does an experienced captain see emergency rockets over an ice field in the middle of the night and simply go back to sleep?
It is the textbook case of cognitive dissonance in a crisis. Captain Lord was already stressed. He knew his own ship was surrounded by dangerous, hull-crushing ice.
Right.
To wake his crew, fire up the boilers, and navigate his ship through an ice field in pitch darkness would put his own vessel and crew at extreme risk.
So his brain subconsciously rationalized away the danger of the other ship.
He convinced himself it was a party, or company signals, because accepting the terrifying reality that a massive liner was sinking nearby would require him to take a dangerous action.
It's easier to believe in absurdity than to face a nightmare.
Exactly. The officers on watch kept staring at the ship. They noted that it looked strange, that its lights seemed to be sitting very low in the water, and eventually that it disappeared entirely.
They informed Captain Lord multiple times. Lord told them to try signaling with a Morse lamp, which is just flashing a light, but he never ordered them to wake up Cyril Evans and turn on the wireless radio.
Depending on the forensic estimates, the Californian was sitting anywhere from 5 to 19 miles away.
Even at the furthest estimate, if Lord had woken Evans, heard the distress call, and navigated carefully, they could have arrived at the Titanic within an hour or two.
They could have been there while the ship was still on the surface. They could have taken on hundreds, maybe thousands of passengers directly from the decks.
Instead, the actual rescue ship, the Carpathia, had to sprint 58 miles through the ice and didn't arrive until almost 2 hours after the Titanic, and most of the people in the water were gone.
The sheer negligence of the Californian, combined with the horrifying survival statistics across the classes, ignited an absolute firestorm when these 705 traumatized survivors finally reached New York on the Carpathia.
The world didn't just mourn, the world demanded a reckoning.
And this shifts our focus to the aftermath, the legal autopsy, and how this disaster forcibly dragged the maritime industry into the 20th century.
The speed of the legal response is actually incredible. The United States Senate didn't even wait for the shock to wear off.
No, they acted immediately.
Led by Senator William Alden Smith of Michigan, they convened an inquiry almost instantly. Smith literally went to the docks to intercept the survivors.
He subpoenaed the surviving British crewmen and, crucially, the White Star Line's managing director, J. Bruce Ismay,
who had controversially survived by stepping into a collapsible lifeboat.
Right, and Smith subpoenaed him before they could even board a ship to return to England.
Because Senator Smith recognized that if Ismay and the crew got back to London, the White Star Line would control the narrative and bury the negligence.
So he set up this surreal, highly aggressive inquiry at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York.
You have to picture this opulent, gilded hotel ballroom transformed into a makeshift courtroom, packed with grieving survivors, sweating executives, and a rabid press corps hanging on every word.
Reading the transcripts, Smith's interrogation tactics were brutal. The British press mocked him as a grandstanding opportunist who didn't understand ships, but Smith was methodically tearing down the illusion of corporate competence.
And both the U.S. inquiry and the subsequent British inquiry, led by Lord Mersey, ultimately zeroed in on a terrifying truth.
The real villain wasn't just Captain Lord or Bruce Ismay. It was the archaic legal code they were operating under.
This brings us to the lifeboat regulations, which is always the most baffling part of the deep dive for modern listeners.
It really is.
The Titanic was carrying 20 lifeboats. The maximum capacity of those boats combined was 11,178 people,
while the ship was certified to carry over 3,300 people,
leaving over 2,000 people mathematically condemned from the moment the ship left the dock.
And yet, I remember reading the Board of Trade rules. They didn't break a single law, did they?
Not one. They were completely legally compliant.
How is that possible?
Under the British Board of Trade regulations, which had been written in 1894, a ship's lifeboat requirement wasn't based on how many passengers it could hold. It was based on the physical tonnage of the vessel.
And incredibly, the highest tier in the 1894 regulations maxed out at ships of 10,000 tons.
But the Titanic was 46,000 tons.
Exactly. The law simply hadn't kept pace with the explosive, exponential growth of industrial steel shipbuilding.
The regulations assumed that a 10,000-ton ship was the absolute pinnacle of size.
So legally, the White Star Line only had to provide lifeboats for a 10,000-ton ship. In fact, by providing 20 lifeboats, the White Star Line actually exceeded the legal requirement.
They could have legally sailed with even fewer.
It is infuriating to think that corporate compliance was treated as an acceptable substitute for basic human safety.
It really reinforces the grim reality that transportation safety regulations are written in blood. The deaths of those 1,500 people forced the world to act.
It completely upended international maritime law. The disaster directly birthed the modern safety framework we rely on today.
In 1914, the maritime nations convened the first International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea, known as SOLAS.
And SOLAS closed all the lethal loopholes we've been talking about. They threw out the tonnage rule and mandated that every single ship must carry enough lifeboats for 100% of the passengers and crew on board. No exceptions.
They also mandated regular, rigorous lifeboat drills, which is crucial because on the Titanic, the crew had practically no training on how to lower the complex davits.
They actually canceled a scheduled lifeboat drill on the very Sunday the ship sank.
SOLAS also directly addressed the communication failure of Cyril Evans and the Californian.
They mandated that all passenger ships must maintain a 24-hour radio watch. Never again could an operator simply turn off his machine and go to sleep while ships navigated hazardous waters.
And finally, they established the International Ice Patrol, an organization funded by multiple nations that continues to this day, using ships and eventually aircraft to constantly monitor and broadcast the positions of icebergs in the North Atlantic.
So the laws adapted, the maritime industry evolved. But the physical ship, the grand staircase, the shattered steel, the boilers, all of it was gone.
For 73 years, the Titanic was a true cold case, lost 2.5 miles down in the pitch-black abyss of the Atlantic.
It became a ghost ship, a myth, until military technology finally caught up to the legend in 1985.
The discovery of the wreck is a brilliant piece of forensic deduction, heavily wrapped in Cold War military secrecy.
For decades, highly funded expeditions tried to find the Titanic and failed completely. They relied on traditional sonar methods, which oceanographers refer to as mowing the lawn.
Right. They would drag a sonar sled back and forth in a tight, methodical grid pattern over the ocean floor, basically hoping the sound waves would bounce off a massive, intact steel hull.
The French team, iframer, spent weeks doing this with their cutting-edge SAR sonar system. They mapped 50% of the target zone and found absolutely nothing but mud.
But the American team, led by Dr. Robert Ballard from the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, took a fundamentally different approach.
And the reason he took that approach was because he wasn't actually there just to find the Titanic. His expedition was a cover for a highly classified U.S. Navy mission.
I love the espionage angle of this. The Navy didn't fund Ballard to hunt for a luxury liner. They funded him to find 2 sunken nuclear submarines.
The USS Thresher and the USS Scorpion, which had been lost in the deep ocean during the Cold War.
Ballard used his new deep-sea towed camera sled, called Argo, to locate the Scorpion. And while studying how that submarine rested on the bottom, he realized a critical physical truth about deep-water wrecks.
He learned the mechanics of the descent. When a massive, heavy object sinks 12,000 feet down through powerful ocean currents, it doesn't just drop straight down like a stone dropped in a puddle.
As it falls, it breaks apart.
The heavier items sink faster, and the lighter items are carried further by the currents.
It creates what Ballard called a debris field, a comet tail of wreckage. He noted that the debris field for the Scorpion submarine was over a mile long.
So Ballard reasoned, stop looking for the hull of the Titanic. The hull is a single, relatively small target in a vast ocean. Look for the blood trail.
Look for the mile-long scatter of coal, plates, luggage, and metal fragments.
So instead of mowing the lawn with sonar, he widened his search lines to a mile apart, and he used the Argo sled to visually scan the ocean floor with cameras in real time.
Imagine the tension in that control room on the research vessel Noor. It's the early hours of September 1st, 1985. The team has been staring at blurry black-and-white video feeds transmitted from 2.5 miles down in the crushing dark for days.
It's monotonous, just mud and craters.
And then suddenly, an anomaly slides across the screen. It's not a rock formation. It's a massive cylindrical, man-made object with a very distinct, recognizable pattern of rivets.
It was one of the Titanic's massive boilers. They had blueprints and 1912 photographs on the ship, and they matched the rivet patterns instantly.
By simply following that trail of debris northward, they finally illuminated the severed, upright bow of the Titanic sitting quietly in the mud. After 73 years, the cold case was physically reopened.
And just finding it answered so many historical arguments. For decades, the official British and American inquiries had largely dismissed survivor claims that the ship broke in half on the surface.
Because the White Star Line experts insisted the steel was too strong to snap?
But the physical evidence vindicated the survivors. The ship was sitting in 2 massive pieces, separated by nearly 2,000 feet.
The sheer weight of the water-filled bow had pulled the stern high into the air, creating stress that the steel simply couldn't handle, snapping the ship violently in 2 before it sank.
But reopening the case didn't just solve old mysteries. It introduced a terrifying new clock.
How so?
Finding the ship revealed that it wasn't a pristine museum exhibit frozen in time. The ocean isn't a static vault. Nature is actively conducting its own slow biological autopsy. The wreck is being consumed.
Which brings us to the final forensic element of our deep dive. The microscopic culprit dismantling this 46,000-ton Leviathan is a newly discovered species of extremophile bacteria.
Literally named RMS Titanic.
For a long time, marine biologists assumed the deep ocean floor was a lifeless, muddy desert. But a shipwreck, like the Titanic, acts as a massive artificial reef, creating a sudden oasis of biodiversity.
However, RMS Titanic isn't just seeking shelter on the steel, it is actively digesting it.
I have to pause on the biology here because how does a microscopic single-celled organism even function at a depth of 12,500 feet? The hydrostatic pressure down there is bone-crushing.
It's roughly 380 atmospheres, which is like having a car parked on your thumbnail.
Add to that the freezing temperatures and the intense salinity. How do their cell walls not just implode?
They survive using a brilliant chemical mechanism. The bacteria rely on a molecule called ectoin.
Ectoin, what does that do?
Ectoin acts as an osmoprotectant. It allows the bacteria to regulate its internal fluid balance and cell volume, essentially matching the internal pressure to the crushing external pressure of the ocean.
So, protected by this ectoin shield, these bacteria latch onto the iron hull. They extract energy by oxidizing the iron, basically eating the steel, and they leave behind a distinct biological waste product.
And those waste products are what give the wreck its haunting, melting appearance today.
Those fragile, reddish-brown, icicle-like formations hanging off every surface. Rusticles. They look solid, but they are actually incredibly brittle. They are complex, symbiotic communities of microbes living in a viscous slime that protects them from the ambient seawater.
And as they feed, they are pulling the structural steel of the ship apart, atom by atom.
The rate of deterioration is staggering. When Ballard first illuminated the bow in 1985, it looked remarkably intact. You could see the wooden decking in some places.
But recent remote expeditions, specifically the dives in 2019 and 2024, have brought back heartbreaking evidence of rapid decay.
The starboard side of the officers' quarters has completely collapsed, folding in on itself.
Captain Smith's iconic bathtub, which was a famous, recognizable image for decades, is now completely buried under fallen, rusted decking.
And the image that really hit the public from the 2024 dive, a large 15-foot section of the iconic portside bow railing, the exact spot made famous by the movies, has completely rotted through, snapped off, and fallen to the seafloor.
The ship is losing its most recognizable features.
Structural engineers and microbiologists like Henrietta Mann have modeled the decay rate. Their estimates vary, but the consensus is grim.
Many predict that by 2030, or maybe 2050 at the latest, the structural integrity of the hull will reach a critical failure point.
The upper decks will pancake down onto the lower decks.
Eventually, the entire bow will collapse, reducing the Titanic to little more than a massive orange rust stain on the ocean floor, surrounded by a scatter of non-biodegradable artifacts.
Things like the porcelain plates, the bronze propellers, and the tannin-treated leather shoes of the victims, which the deep-sea organisms won't consume.
Wait, so we're literally watching history dissolve in real time?
Yeah.
Is there any engineering intervention possible, or do we just have to sit back and let nature erase it?
There is no stopping it. You simply cannot wrap a 46,000-ton steel structure in a protective, anti-corrosive bubble 2.5 miles underwater.
And this physical reality has ignited a fierce, ongoing ethical debate in the archaeological community.
On one side, you have conservationists and private salvage companies who argue that because the ship is dying, we have a moral imperative to recover as many artifacts as possible before they are lost forever.
They want to bring up the telegraph machine that sent the final distress calls, the personal items, the luggage, to preserve them in climate-controlled museums.
And the pushback against that is intense.
Very intense. On the other side are historians, descendants, and discoverers, like Robert Ballard, who vehemently argue that the Titanic is a mass grave.
Over 1,500 people died freezing in that exact spot.
They believe the site should be treated with the solemn reverence of a cemetery and left undisturbed. They argue that aggressively recovering artifacts is tantamount to grave robbing.
And they point out that the physical intrusion of heavy submersibles constantly landing on the fragile deck has actually accelerated the ship's collapse.
It's a profound dilemma. Do you aggressively harvest the objects to ensure the history is tangible for future generations? Or do you respect the sanctity of the grave and let the ocean slowly reclaim its dead?
As we zoom out from the microscopic bacteria eating the hull to the macro impact of this disaster, we have to look at the massive human ripple effect.
Because this deep dive isn't just a story about brittle steel, high sulfur content, or archaic lifeboat laws.
It's fundamentally about families. Generations of family trees were violently pruned or completely rewritten by the events of that single night.
If you think about the steerage passengers, the sheer economic devastation is hard to overstate.
These were mostly immigrants carrying their entire family's life savings sewn into their coats. They were the hope for a new life.
When they went down in the dark, their families back in Europe lost their sole source of financial support.
And the descendants they might have had, the lives they might have built in America, were simply erased from the timeline. The loss reverberated across oceans and generations.
And the tragedy was even weaponized in broader social movements in ways that feel incredibly cynical today.
Looking at the sources here, it's wild how this was spun. In the decade following the disaster, the women's suffrage movement was fiercely fighting for the right to vote in both the United States and the United Kingdom.
And conservative politicians actually used the Titanic's survival statistics against them in legislative debates.
Wait, how do you use a shipwreck to argue against women voting?
By pointing to the women and children first survival rates, they looked at the data showing that roughly 75% of the women survived, compared to only 20% of the men.
And so anti-suffrage politicians stood up and argued that this proved women were already perfectly protected by the chivalry and sacrifice of men.
They argued that because men were willing to stand back and die for them on a sinking ship, women didn't need the vote or political independence.
Now, obviously our sources are just reporting on the history of this, but it shows how the brutal tragedy of the Titanic was twisted into political propaganda to undermine women's voices.
It perfectly encapsulates the Edwardian social geometry we discussed earlier. The Titanic was a floating microcosm of 1912 society.
Its sinking dragged all the rigid, flawed, and brutal realities of that world out into the freezing light.
It forced a global reckoning. It destroyed the arrogant, Gilded Age illusion that human engineering had somehow conquered nature.
It demanded that we write new maritime laws, design smarter ships, and eventually develop the deep-sea military technology to go back down into the dark and figure out exactly the chemistry and physics of what went wrong.
And now, a century later, nature is quietly finishing the job. Which brings us full circle to how we started this conversation.
We talked about how we usually like our history safely under a glass case, untouchable, clean, and pristine.
But the Titanic defies that. It's a violent crime scene of industrial hubris that is actively being eaten away by the very environment it was built to conquer.
It forces us to confront the impermanence of physical evidence.
Exactly. So I want to leave you with this final thought. Think about the timeline we're on right now.
When Halimanus Titanicae finishes its slow meal in the next 20 or 30 years, the physical body of the Titanic will be gone forever.
The sweeping bow, the grand staircase, the brittle steel plates that shattered in the cold, they will all dissolve into the deep ocean current.
Once the physical steel vanishes completely, does the tragedy slowly fade into just another ancient myth like Atlantis? Or does a crime scene still matter when the scene itself ceases to exist?
It's a haunting question. Does our forensic understanding and the lessons we learned survive the total disappearance of the evidence?
Something to mull over the next time you look out at the ocean. Thank you for pulling up a chair and sharing these notes with us on this deep dive. Take care.
Until next time.